Are you ready for the word? Let's get into it. Go to Galatians 3. Look at verse 23. But before faith came, we were kept under the law, kept under Torah, shut up under the faith which should afterwards be revealed. Now look in Galatians 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of time was come, Yahweh sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Now drop down to verse 21. Tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? And then in Galatians 5:18. But if you be led of the Spirit, you are not under the law. We're doing a verse-by-verse study through the book of Galatians. But we have paused the verse-by-verse part of the study of Galatians to deal with a specific phrase or term that Paul used 5 times in his epistle to the Galatians. A phrase that he used a total of 12 times throughout all of his epistles. And that phrase is under the law. It's a phrase that the lawless latch onto and use to argue that we no longer have to keep Torah or follow Torah. We are not under the law, they say with a lot of conviction if they're ever challenged about forsaking the Sabbath or forsaking the holy days or forsaking dietary laws. They will vehemently say to you, we're not under the law anymore. So it's necessary to pause and deal with this phrase, under the law. As we begin, I will quickly admit to you that it irritates me just a little bit that such an explanation is necessary. Don't get me wrong, I love studying the Bible and I love teaching. When I say it irritates me, I'm not so much irritated at people that are deceived as I am irritated at the deceivers who have taken Bible verses out of context and used them against people. Every time I have this conversation with someone about whether we are to follow Torah or not, and they bring up what they think Paul said, I want to grab them in a kind manner and shake them and simply say to them, who do you follow? Paul or Yeshua? Your pastor or Yeshua? Your denomination or Yeshua? Who died for you? Who lives in you? Right? What did He say about Torah? Now, don't get me wrong there either with what I just said. I do not think for 1 minute that Paul ever said or taught anything that contradicted Yeshua or contradicted Peter or James or John. Don't believe for 1 minute he ever did that. But there are people out there who do believe that he contradicted them or built upon them or had a revelation that they did not have. But even if somebody thinks that, my point's the same. I think the question is simple. Who do you follow? If you think Paul had a greater revelation, the point is still the same. Who do you follow? Do you follow Paul or do you follow Yeshua? And if you follow Yeshua, what did he say about Torah? And I know we've looked at this many times, but I can't ask that question without looking at it again. So let's go to Matthew 5. Matthew 5:17. Think not. Do not think that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. To destroy means to do away with. He said, I did not come to do away with it. I come to fulfill it. Notice that he does not say in verse 17, I am come to do it so that you won't have to, or so that you don't have to. That's the way people read that, but that's not what it says. He didn't say, I'm come to do it so you won't have to. He said, I am come to fulfill it. That word fulfill it could be translated this way, I'm come to fully preach it, or I'm come to fully live it, or both. I'm come to fully live it and to fully preach it. Verse 18, for verily I say unto you, verily, this is the truth. What I'm about to say to you is truth. Mark it down. Till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Not one jot, not one tittle will pass. That is, be omitted, perish, or pass away. Well, what does that mean for those who will live after the resurrection? Read the next verse. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Let's just do a real quick word study here before we move on from that verse. You look back in verse 17 at the word destroy. That is the Greek word kataluo. Kataluo means to break something down. It means to literally bring something to an end. So when he says, do not think I came to destroy the law, he's do not think that I came to bring it to an end. It is a word used to refer to the end of a journey. You know, you may have been traveling for days or weeks or months, but you finally arrive home. You might shout when you get there, Kataluo, which means the journey's over. It's through. It's done away with. That journey is finished. Yeshua said, do not think I am come saying that the law is over. No, I'm coming saying that we have to become more determined than ever to walk in this journey of Torah. Okay? Now look down in verse 19. In verse 19 we see the word break. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments. That is the Greek word luo. Destroy is kataluo. Break comes from the Greek word luo, the root, the base, luo. Luo means to loosen oneself. To loosen oneself. If you say kataluo, you're saying their journey's over. If you say luo, you're saying the journey may not be over, but I'm done. I've gone as far as I'm going to go. I am loosing myself from any more obligation on this journey. So the reason I wanted us to break that down is if you go back and look at verse 17, Yeshua said, do not think that I am come to kataluo. There is no one who has the authority to kataluo Torah except YAHWEH. To bring it to an end and finished, nobody has that authority. And Yeshua said, don't think I came to do that. I did not come to bring it to an end. He said that YAHWEH would not bring it to an end either as long as heaven and earth stood. No man can kataluo Torah. No man has the authority to say, it's finished, it's done away with, it's over. No man has that authority. However, a man can, if he chooses, to luo Torah. No man can say Torah is no longer for us, but a man can say, there's parts of it I'm not going to do. That's what break means. He is saying it may not be through, but I'm through feeling obligated to it. I'm not going to do what it says anymore. Now listen to what Yeshua said in verse 19. He said, any man that does that to the least commandment, that is, breaks it or teaches others to do so, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Now think about that for just a moment. This is just if a man said that a commandment is least in importance. Yeshua said if a man says that, treats it as being insignificant, then he will be treated as being insignificant. What if a man said that commandment is no longer relevant? What if a man said that commandment is no longer for us at all today? What would the kingdom of heaven say about that man? Exactly. Well, he would be called not important, not relevant, and not for the kingdom of heaven today. So let's go on and look at something else Yeshua said about Torah. Go to John 5:46. We're coming back to Matthew 7 afterward, but I want to look at John 5:46 first. For had you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. People that say Torah is just about a bunch of do's and don'ts have never read Torah. Right. Yeshua said Torah is all about him. But if you believe not his writings, the writings of Moses, how shall ye believe my words? So to dismiss Torah is to dismiss the Messiah. You can't dismiss Torah without dismissing him, because he said it's all about me. All right, to dismiss the true Messiah is to pave the way for the anti-Messiah, the false Messiah, the Greek Messiah. And then Yeshua said this in Matthew 7, verse 21. Not everyone that says unto me, Master, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. We usually speed right past that verse, but let's stop and talk about that for just a moment. He that does the will of my Father. Define what a will is. A will is a determination and a decree about what shall be done. A determination and a decree about what shall be done. Torah is Yahweh's determination and Yahweh's decree about what shall be done. So Yeshua said, not everyone that says to me, Master, will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Those that will enter into the kingdom of heaven are those who do what my Father has determined and decreed that they are supposed to do. And that's found in Torah. You know, people are told all the time, if you'll just say this prayer and declare Jesus to be your Lord, you'll be saved. That's a direct contradiction to what Yeshua just said in verse 21. Yeshua said they can call me Lord all day long and still not get into the kingdom of heaven. Right. Calling me Lord is not enough. Only those who do what my Father has determined and decreed is to be done will enter into the kingdom of heaven. That is, those who keep Torah. And that truth is restated twice in the book of Revelation. Twice in Revelation we're told of those who have the testimony of Yeshua and keep the commandments. Well, that's the same thing Yeshua is saying in Matthew 7:21. Now look at verse 22. Many will say to me in that day, Master, have we not prophesied in your name, and in your name cast out devils, and in your name done many wonderful works? This is an interesting verse to me, because what was happening there is the same thing we see happening in our day. Those who preach against Torah usually tell us that we're trying to earn our salvation, and that's why we keep Torah. Well, they sure are doing a lot of works to try and prove they're saved. But notice it was not their prophecies that would prove they're saved. Notice that it wasn't their deliverance ministry that proved they were saved. Notice that it's not their drama team, their light show, their massive crowds, their huge, massive crowds singing in unison in praise with their hands raised. It's not those things that prove they're saved. Yeshua said twice what the proof was that they're saved. Doing the will of the Father. That's what proves it. And doing the will of the Father is what is determined and decreed in Torah. And here he said it in verse 22 this way, or excuse me, in verse 23 this way, then I will profess unto them, I never knew you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity. So doing the will of Yahweh and not being lawless, those are one and the same thing. Iniquity is anomia, lawlessness without a law. Well, that's what Yeshua said. So if you think Paul said anything different than that, he didn't, but if you think that he did, the question is simple. Who do you follow? Can Paul save you? Did Paul die for you? Who is the Messiah that you follow? The Messiah that you follow, the true Messiah, is the one who said that we have to walk in Torah. Now, the purpose of our study this morning is to show that Paul did not say anything different than Yeshua, or Peter, or James, or John. It's just that some of the ways he said it are hard to understand. To correctly understand him, you have to do three things. Number one, you have to have a baseline to start from. Number two, you have to study all of his writings in context. And number three, you have to define the words he used correctly. The baseline is this. Yeshua said that Torah will stand forever. And Yeshua said that those that follow him are to walk in it. So if anyone thinks Paul said we don't have to keep it, misunderstood Paul. Go back to the baseline. He followed Yeshua. We're following Yeshua. Yeshua kept Torah and told us to keep Torah. So that's the baseline. So if I read something Paul wrote and it sounds like he's saying I don't have to keep Torah, I'm misreading it. So you got to have a plumb line, a baseline to start from. If anybody thinks that Paul said we're not under the law and meant that those who are saved by grace through faith don't have to keep it, they misunderstood Paul. That's the baseline. As to the other two things, study his words in context and define the words he used correctly. That's what we're doing. And that's what we're going to do this morning. We're taking the phrase under the law and putting it in context and defining the words Paul used. Law, it comes from the Greek word nomos, and it refers to Torah. Last week we spent a lot of time looking at the Greek word hupo, translated under. And does anybody remember what the word hupo means? To be in an inferior position to. And if the word inferior seems too negative to you, or that bothers you, you could turn it around in a positive way and say it this way. It's to recognize that there is somebody or something that has authority over you to whom you are to submit. Okay? Last week we looked at Matthew 8:9, where the centurion said this to Yeshua. I am a man under hupo, under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this man, go, and he goes. To this man, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. So this man recognized there was someone who had authority over him that he was obligated to submit to and to obey. And he recognized that there were people who recognized his authority over them, and that it was their duty to submit to and obey him. Right? So that's what the word hupo means. So this context and definition of the word sheds a lot of light on the phrase under the law. It means to acknowledge that Yahweh's will, what he has determined and decreed to be done, his authority over us is in that will. He has authority over us. He expresses his will in Torah, and we are obligated to submit to and obey that. That's what being under the law means. I am obligated to submit to Yahweh's will, to do what he has determined that I am to do. Obeying Torah is not obeying some arbitrary rules. Obeying Torah is obeying Yahweh. It's a shame that people look at it as, well, no, that's just that old law, that thing Moses wrote. No, it is Yahweh. When I obey Torah, I'm obeying the Father. Everybody's inspired by and loves to quote Peter where he says, especially in times like we're living in now, loves to quote Peter where he said, we ought to obey Yahweh and not man. Those are powerful words, aren't they? We ought to obey Yahweh and not man. Well, okay. Do it. Search the scriptures and see where your beliefs differ from what Torah says. Obey Torah. Right. Search the scriptures and see where your denominational doctrines differ from Torah. Obey Torah. Search the scriptures and see where your pastor's teachings differ from Torah. Obey Torah. Right? When there is a difference between what you have been taught or being taught, what you believe, when there is a difference between the two, obey Yahweh. We ought to. Isn't that what Peter said? We ought to obey Yahweh. It's that simple. Let me show you another interesting point. Let me state the point and then I'll show you the scriptural references to demonstrate it. Gentiles were never under the law, so any reference to them now not being under the law doesn't apply. How can they no longer be under the law if they never were under the law to start with? Does that make sense? Okay. What does it mean to be under? To be in an inferior position to recognize its authority, submit to it, and obey it. Right? Gentiles never saw themselves or knew to see themselves in a position where they were to submit to the authority of Torah. A person in that position cannot be redeemed. Why can they not be redeemed if they're in that position? Because they have no concept of why they would need redemption. None. And so that they can't repent if they don't see anything they need to repent of. Look in Galatians 4:4. When the fullness of time was come, Yahweh sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law. Those who recognized its authority were submitted to it and obeying it. He came to redeem them that we, Paul was one of them, so he uses the pronoun we, that we might receive the adoption of sons. The Gentiles, and that's what the point Paul makes in Galatians 4, the Gentiles are the adopted sons. They had to have those who were under the law come and explain salvation to them before they could be saved. Somebody who was under the law had to come to the Gentiles and explain salvation to them. There is no way they could be saved apart from that. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 20. And unto the Jews I became a Jew, as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. So the Jews were under the law. If you read Galatians 3:23, you understand that that is a protected place of privilege. It says in Galatians 3:23 that we were kept under the law. The word kept means guarded and protected. The word kept communicates protection and provision provided by Torah. We were kept under the law. Well, that's not the condition of the Gentile. Read the next verse. To them that are without the law, as without law, being not without law to Yahweh, but under the law to the Messiah, that I might gain them that are without law. Gentiles are without law. They're not under the law, they are without law. The Greek word here is anomos, A-N-O-M-O-S, anomos or anomos. And the word anomos means lawless, without law. That distinction has to be recognized. Jews were kept under the law. Gentiles were lawless. Which condition would be preferred? To hear people talk today, you'd think you'd be better off to be lawless. That's not so. That's a horrible condition to be in. The more preferred condition is one who is being kept by the law. Who did Yeshua come to redeem? Those who were under the law. Who was able to receive the adoption of sons? Those who were under the law. Gentiles owe a debt of gratitude not only to Yahweh and to Yeshua, but also to those who were kept under the law. For had they not been faithful to preserve the oracles of Yahweh, we would not even know who Yahweh or Yeshua are. Okay? So, when you think of someone being under the law, do not think of it as a negative. It's a positive. Being anomos is a negative. Being lawless is a negative. Well, If that's true, and it is, then why did Paul say in Galatians 5 that we are not under the law? And the reason Paul said that is because when a man is redeemed, I think we sometimes forget it and we shouldn't, but when a man is redeemed, an amazing and wonderful thing happens. Yahweh does a work on the inside of us. He turns our heart of stone into a fleshly heart, a new heart. We become the temple of Yahweh. We become indwelt by the resurrected Messiah. We become filled with the Ruach HaKodesh. This is a greater position to be in than just being kept under the law. Okay? Being kept under the law is a wonderful place, but it's difficult. Let me say that again. Being kept under the law is a wonderful, amazing, great place to be, but it's a difficult place to be. Not because the law is difficult, but because our carnal mind wars against Yahweh. Romans 8:7. The carnal mind is enmity against Yahweh. It is not subject to the law of Yahweh, neither indeed can be. Verse 8. So they that are in the flesh cannot please Yahweh. The problem never was the law. Right. That's not what makes it difficult. What makes it difficult is an unredeemed mind and an unregenerated heart. So being under the law is a wonderful place, but a difficult place because of the wrestle and the war that takes place on the inside of a man. It was not the law that Yahweh had to fix, it was us. Yes. So He did. Consider this for just a moment. Consider how that Paul and others of his day stood on a dividing line in history. And because they stood on that dividing line, they could talk about things from a perspective that the rest of us only can read about. On one side of the line, they had the law which they knew they were to submit to and obey, and so they sought to do that. But they were always, let me say it this way, they were not always obedient. They transgressed. They sometimes found it difficult to do what they were told to do. And they found it difficult not because Torah was difficult, but because their flesh was so strong. You'll never see them criticizing Torah and saying, this was just too hard to do. Yahweh told us to do stuff we couldn't do. No, if you read about those who lived in that dividing line and before, if you read about it, they talk about how it was they who needed to be changed and brought under control, not the change in the law. Okay? Go to Romans 7 and let's listen to Paul describe this war that takes place on the inside. Romans 7 verse 14. For we know, everybody say we know. We know the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. So what did Paul just say? The law is not the problem. The problem's me, not the law. You see that? Yes. All right, read the next verse. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. He said it again. The law is not the problem's me. Verse 17. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good, I find not. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Now if I do that, I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwells in me. I find then a law that when I would do good, evil is present with me. For I delight in the law of Yahweh after the inward man, But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. Paul said, I am a slave held captive by sin. See that in verse 23? It brings me into captivity. I am a slave being held captive by sin. Verse 24, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? You ever felt that way? Ever had a struggle taking place on the inside of you? Now don't answer me yet, but think about that. You ever felt that way? So many times this passage gets quoted and used as an explanation of why we sin or why we transgress Torah. Have you ever transgressed Torah? Okay. Do you know why you did? Do you know that we cannot use Romans 7 as the reason? I'm talking about in our present condition, we cannot use Romans 7 as the reason we transgress Torah. In Romans 7, Paul is describing what life was like on the dividing line of history. What life was like before Yeshua came and redeemed us. We were held captive by what he has called an old, or the law of sin, what others have called the old sin nature. Trying to keep the law was difficult because the carnal mind despised the law. And so Paul cried out in verse 24, who will deliver me from this body of death? Paul was saying, man, I want it. The law was spiritual. The law was holy. The law was good. I could acknowledge that. But every time I was trying to do what it said, I found a war taking place inside of me that wanted to rebel against it. What it told me to do, on the inside I didn't want to do. What it told me I couldn't do, on the inside I found out that's the very thing I wanted to do. It was just a war going on inside of me, and I'm crying out, who's going to deliver me? And you listen to people talk today and you think he didn't answer that question, but he did answer that question. And the answer is, I thank Yahweh through Yeshua HaMashiach, our Master. So then with the mind I serve the law of Yahweh, but with the flesh the law of sin. There has been a deliverance. So we are redeemed. So if we are redeemed, old things passed away. Behold, all things are become new. We've been given a new heart. We've been given a new mind. We cannot quote Romans 7 and use it to excuse transgressions. Have you ever transgressed Torah since you've been redeemed? Do you know why you did, if you did? Have you ever transgressed Torah since you've been redeemed? And if you did, do you know why you did? The answer is simple. Because we wanted to. It's no longer because we were helpless. It's no longer because there's this war going on and I can't find the power to win. No, that's no longer the condition. Right. Paul's in a dividing line. Paul could say, man, before Yeshua came, we were kept under the law and we were doing the best we could, but it was hard and difficult and we were crying out for a Redeemer. We needed help. And then he came and we got the help. And Paul's saying, so now I want y'all to understand what it means to not just be under the law. Just being under the law, there's no help. But when you get redeemed, there is help, right? That's what Paul meant when he said in Galatians 5, we are not under the law. It was a conditional statement. The whole statement is this. In Galatians 5, he said, if you are led of the Spirit, you're not under the law. Under the law, you recognize its authority and you did your best to obey. Led of the Spirit, you recognize His authority and you obey Him. Let me say that again. Under the law, you recognize its authority and you seek to obey it. Led of the Spirit, you recognize His authority and you obey Him. And He will always lead you in the path of righteousness. He empowers us to obey. It's a more empowered position that enables us to walk free of sin and to walk in obedience. Paul used the imagery of a schoolmaster to illustrate it. The Greek word we've seen there is pahidagogos, and we've done a lot of talk about that word pahidagogos, but for simplicity's sake today I'll just refer to the schoolmaster. The schoolmaster takes a child, and it's his duty, we've said, to train that child to think, believe, and act like who? His dad. Like his dad. Okay? To think, believe, and act like his dad. Come here, Colin. Come stand with me for a minute. Imagine that I am Matthew's most trusted servant, and he lays upon me the responsibility of being with this boy day and night. He doesn't leave the house unless I go with him. Now, what is it Matthew wants me to instill in that boy? What I think? What I believe? How I act? No, Matthew certainly hopes that I'm a trusted servant, right? But Matthew tells me what he wants this boy to think, what he wants him to believe, how he wants him to act. And it's like him. And so I spend every day with him. We go everywhere together, right? I take this boy and I go to school with him. I play in the yard with him. I teach him to say yes, sir, and no, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. I teach him to treat the poor as well as he does the rich. Right? I teach him how to respond in every situation that could possibly confront him. Right? How long do I do that? Till he's 60? Till he's 70? How long do I do that? Till he comes of age, right? And then what do? I turn him back over to his father. Is that correct? You can go back. Thank you, Colin. I turn him over to his dad. He's no longer under the schoolmaster. Does all the instruction disappear? No. Where did the instruction come from? From the dad. Who's he going to be hanging out with now? The dad. What if he and his dad are hanging out and he's 28 years old and they're out doing the thing and Matthew tells him that he wants him to do a certain thing? What if Colin said, well, hold on. I'm going to go find Steve, the schoolmaster, and I'm going to make sure that it's okay with him before I do that. Right? He's no longer under the schoolmaster. You understand that? He's going backward, and we failed somewhere if he doesn't understand that all I was doing was getting him to know the thoughts, the beliefs, and the morals of his dad. And everything his dad tells him to do is right. Paul is using that exact same imagery here. When you take this illustration and bring it to its logical conclusion, the goal is to get the boy grown to a place that he can walk in unison and fellowship with his dad. The goal of Torah is to get us to a place that we can walk in unison and fellowship with the dad. And that we can hear his spirit on the inside of us. And so that in every situation we know what to say and what to do. And we recognize what's right and we recognize what's wrong. There's something on the inside of us bearing witness. Because not only have we got the Father and the Ruach HaKodesh dwelling on the inside of us, but He put His law in our hearts and in our minds. It's not a matter of walking around with the law saying, okay, well, what am I supposed to do today? No. It's a matter of walking in fellowship with our Father. Okay? Which brings us to that often quoted verse in Romans 6:14. Go there, because everything I've said so far was just to get us to this verse. For sin, verse 14, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. It's actually sad how often people quote that verse without any concept of its context or any concept of the definition of the word grace. Let's look at the context and then we'll get the biblical definition of grace. To get the context, we're going to back up and start reading in verse 1. Is that okay with you? What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? This chapter is about how we should not be transgressing Torah because we've been changed on the inside. When you read Romans 6, understand that this chapter is about how we should not transgress Torah because we've been changed on the inside. Verse 2, Yahweh forbid, how shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? See, there it is. Verse 3, know ye not that so many of us as were baptized into Yeshua HaMashiach were baptized into His death? Therefore we're buried with Him by baptism into His death, that like as the Messiah was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of His death, we shall be also in the likeness of His resurrection. Notice there, talking about us being like Him. Notice verse 4, walking in newness of life. There's something that has transpired on the inside of us that has changed us. In Ephesians, Paul explains how that in Ephesians 1, he explains how he wished we would come to understand that the very same power that Yahweh used to raise Yeshua from the dead is now working on the inside of us. We're not lacking power. The resurrection power of Yahweh abides inside of us, effectually working, Paul said, inside of us. Verse 6, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with Him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. There's been a change that took place on the inside of us. Verse 7, for he that is dead is freed from sin. Now if we be dead with the Messiah, we believe that we shall also live with Him. Knowing that the Messiah, being raised from the dead, dies no more, death has no more dominion over Him. For in that He died unto sin once, but in that He lives unto Yahweh. Likewise, reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto Yahweh through Yeshua HaMashiach our Master. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lust thereof. So we have a choice. You can let it, or you can choose to not let it. He says, do not let sin therefore reign. Verse 13, neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto Yahweh as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto Yahweh. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law but under grace. The point of those 14 verses is stated in the first few words of verse 14. The point of the 14 verses is stated in the first few words of verse 14. And the point is this: sin shall not have dominion over you. Yeah. Why can sin no longer have dominion over you? Because of grace. sin cannot have dominion over you because of grace. Well, that makes us, or should make us want to know what grace is. We're no longer just under the authority of Torah and trying our best to keep it. No, we've been made alive, changed, reborn, indwelt, and empowered to live righteously. The desire to transgress the law shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law. You're not just doing your best to obey it. You are under this thing called grace. So what is grace? One thing we know for sure that it's not an excuse for sin, because He's telling us we ought not do that. It's not a covering for sin, because He's telling us we ought not do that. If you read the context, you find out, and all you got to do is read those 14 verses together, and it becomes real clear. Grace is that thing that keeps us from sinning. Grace isn't the thing that excuses our sinning. Grace isn't the thing that says, oh, it's okay that you sin. Grace is the thing that keeps you from sinning. Let's talk about grace. You'll see in the Old Testament the word grace, and it's translated from the Hebrew word Cain. And Cain in Hebrew, the Hebrew word Cain means to find favor. In the New Testament, you see this word grace, and it's translated from the Greek word charis, C-H-A-R-I-S, charis. This Greek word also translated grace, just like Cain is. Cain means to find favor, but the definition of charis is very different than finding favor. The only way to explain it is to show you how it's used. Go to Acts 4. And we're going to look at several passages of Scripture as we bring this thing to a close. But the only way to find out what grace means, what charis means, is to look at it in context. Acts 4:33. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Master Yeshua, and great grace was upon them all. So grace was something that could be witnessed as being upon the apostles. Grace was on them, and it's mentioned in connection with great power. Because of the way they were witnessing with great power, people could look at them and say, whew, they covered up with grace. You see that? Do you? As you read through the book of Acts, you're going to discover every time this word is used, grace was something that Barnabas saw it in action. Grace was something that believers were told to continue in. Grace was something that people were recommended to, as in Acts 14:26. And thence sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of YAHWEH for the work which they fulfilled. So, they were recommended to the grace of YAHWEH. Why? They had a work to do, and they needed the power of YAHWEH to get it done. Acts 15:40. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of YAHWEH. They had a work to do, and it was a dangerous work. They needed grace to get it done. That is an enabling power. So grace in the book of Acts is recognized as being the power of YAHWEH that enables somebody to do what they're sent to do. You take today's concept of grace, or what people think grace is, and try to use it in any of those verses, and it won't fit. Grace is not a covering of sin. Grace is an empowering to accomplish a thing. Look in Acts 20, verse 32. And now, brethren, I commend you to YAHWEH and to the word of His grace, which is able to build you up and to give you an inheritance among all them which are sanctified. So grace has the power to build people up. Grace is able to give you an inheritance among those that are sanctified. Go to Romans now. Romans 3:24. Being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in the Messiah, Yeshua. Justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in the Messiah. It took grace to justify us. And grace did not wink at or cover its eyes or turn away from and excuse our sin. Grace was able to justify us, it says, through the redemptive work of Yahweh through Yeshua. That's a reference to power. Do you have any concept of how much power it took to plan and execute our salvation? Yahweh, who sees the end from the beginning, had to do everything perfectly in every age to bring about our redemption. In the beginning, He set out a plan, knowing that the hordes of hell would fight against it in every way they could. But with great power and great precision, He brought it to pass, and in the fullness of time, Yeshua was born under the law to redeem them that were under the law. It took power to make that happen when it did, and to make it happen as it did. It took power to raise Yeshua from the dead. Great power. And so when the Bible says we're justified by grace, it's always said you're justified by grace through the redemptive work of Yahweh through Yeshua. Grace is the power of Yahweh doing a redemptive work that allows us to be justified. Okay? So grace is a reference to power. Romans 5:2. By whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand and rejoice in hope of the glory of Yahweh. So grace is the means by which we stand. Drop down to verse 19. Romans 5:19. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. That as sin has reigned in the death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Yeshua HaMashiach our Master. So grace has to reign, and it reigns through righteousness. And if you go back and go through Romans 6, you get a definition of what righteousness is. Notice here it talks about obedience and disobedience. By one man's disobedience many were made sinners, and by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Disobedience to what? What Yahweh said. Obedience to what? What Yahweh said, right? The law entered, sin abounded, and grace did much more abound. The power to set us free from sin and its dominion abounded. So grace abounds to do what? When sin abounded, grace did much more abound. What is grace abounding to do? To cover our sin? No. Grace is abounding to empower us to overcome sin. All right, look in Romans 6:14 again. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under the law, but under grace. Sin shall not have dominion. The power that controls your flesh and wants you to transgress Torah shall not have dominion. Why? Because now the tables have turned. You don't just have Torah, you have grace. Grace is the power of Yahweh at work inside of you. If we sin now, it's not because we're helpless. If we sin now, it's because of choice. Romans 6:15. What then, shall we sin? Because we're not under the law, but under grace? Yahweh forbid. And in the very next verses, Paul uses the illustration of being a slave. A slave to sin or a slave to righteousness. A slave is in an inferior position. So Paul's saying you can be in an inferior position to sin, or you can be in an inferior position to righteousness. So all of chapter 6 need to be read in context. Listen to this in verse 20. For when you were the servants of sin, you were free from righteousness. The word free means to be unrestrained. If you're a slave to sin, you're not restrained to do righteousness. There's nothing restraining you to do righteousness. But if you're free from sin, no longer restrained by its dominion, then you can become a servant of righteousness. That's the point. Grace frees us from sin. We're no longer restrained by it, so now we can do righteousness. And what is righteousness? Read Romans 5, read Romans 6. You find out that righteousness is obedience to Torah. Obedience to Torah is righteousness. Look at a few other verses, and I'll wrap it up. Romans 12:6. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, whether prophecy, let us prophesy according to the proportion of faith. So, notice that grace is the power behind every heavenly gift by which a man ministers. Having gifts differing according to the grace that's given. Do you see then the definition of grace? Grace is the power that enables us to operate in those gifts. Romans 15:15. Nevertheless, brethren, I've written the more boldly unto you in some sort, as putting you in mind because of the grace that is given to me of Yahweh. 1 Corinthians 3:10. According to the grace of Yahweh, which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I've laid the foundation. So grace was given to aid him laying foundations. 1 Corinthians 15:10. But by the grace of Yahweh I am what I am, and His grace which was bestowed upon me was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all. Yet not I, but the grace of Yahweh which was with me. So Paul says that grace labored abundantly with me. Paul said, I was able to do everything I did more abundantly than any other apostle. I did it because of the grace that was on me. Grace moves men to live righteously, to give abundantly, and to labor tirelessly. I'm not going to take the time, I've got it here, but I'm not going to take the time. You can write these down, make a note of them. But go look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Read that entire chapter. Go read 2 Corinthians chapter 9. You'll find that Paul is referring to, writing about an offering that they're taking up for those in Jerusalem. And Paul keeps referring to grace as being the thing that will empower them to give. Not only does he say grace will be empower them to give, in 2 Corinthians 8:19 he says this, and not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace, which is administered by us to the glory of the same master and declaration of your ready mind. In other words, Paul said, we're going around taking up collections. And I have a collection to take to Jerusalem, and Titus is going with us. He's going to travel with us with this grace. He called the money grace. In 2 Corinthians 9, 10, and 15, it simply states there again, the monetary gift is a result of exceeding grace, power, and motivation working in people to give. If anybody gave in that collection, it was because grace empowered them to give. So the money and the power to give the money was an act of grace. All right. The most clear definition of it, and probably should have started with this one, is in 2 Corinthians 12 where Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. And 3 times he besought Yahweh that this thorn in the flesh would be taken away. What was Yahweh's answer to him?
Grace.
Say it out loud.
My grace is sufficient.
He said 3 times, I besought Yahweh that He would take away this thorn in the flesh. And Yahweh said to me, my grace is sufficient. Listen to this, verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of the Messiah may rest upon me. So if you ever want a definition of grace, right there it is. Isn't it? There's the definition of grace. Grace is the strength of Yahweh overpowering any and all of our weaknesses. No matter what our weakness is, Yahweh says, my grace is sufficient for you. That leaves us without excuse. Wow. It is the power of the anointing of Yahweh on our bodies. And Paul said, whew, I get happy every time I see a weakness I have. I look and say, boy, I'm weak in that area. Hallelujah. Grace is going to come on me. See? That's good stuff. Ephesians 1:7, in whom we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sin according to the riches of His grace. Ephesians 2:8, for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is the gift of Yahweh. You are saved. Mark this down. For by grace are you saved through faith. Mark this in your mind and never forget it. When you read that, you ought to read it and hear this. For by the mighty power of Yahweh I was saved. Yes. Not of anything I did. It was His power that saved me. Ephesians 4:7, but unto every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of the Messiah. So this cannot be a reference to favor, it's a reference to power. And how much power is needed is determined by what we're assigned to do. Hebrews 4:16, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy. People get mercy and grace mixed up. We come to the throne of grace to obtain mercy. We need mercy. But we don't come there just to get the mercy. We come there to get the grace. And what does grace do? What does the last part of the verse say? What does the grace do? The grace helps us. We find mercy, kindness, favor. But Yahweh doesn't just want to give us kindness and favor. He wants to empower us so that thing doesn't ever happen again. Hebrews 10:29. Of how much sore punishment suppose ye shall he be thought worthy who has trodden under foot the Son of Yahweh, counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and done so despite unto the Spirit of grace. Hebrews 12 is warning about transgressing in such a way that you think, well, I'll find mercy, and forgetting that there's grace there to aid us so that we don't do these things. Hebrews 12:15, looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of Yahweh, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. What Paul's talking about in Hebrews 12 is just having to live life. Living life can get tough sometimes. And what Paul's talking about here is root of bitterness and troubles and issues and just wanting to sometimes just get ugly with people. And Paul said if you give in to that, he said it doesn't make any sense, because how is it possible for you to fail if grace is there? The power of Yahweh is there. Any failure is inexcusable. One more. Well, two more. James 4. Verse 5, do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit that dwells in us lusts to envy? I don't think, personally, and I'm open to discuss it, but I personally don't think that this is speaking of the Ruach HaKodesh. It's talking about our own personal spirit, our spirit. It's not capitalized in the King James, and I think that's probably right. The Spirit that dwells in us lusts to envy, so we could say it this way. The Spirit in us has great desires. The Spirit in us has great desires. But, verse 6, He gives more grace. The Spirit in us has great desires, but the Spirit that Yahweh placed in us is greater than our own desires if we will humble ourselves. That's what it says in the next verse. Wherefore He saith, Yahweh resists the proud, but gives grace unto the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to Yahweh, resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. So grace empowers us to resist the devil. The Spirit in us lusts to envy. But He gives us grace so that we can plant our feet, resist the devil, and when the devil sees that grace of Yahweh comes on us, he doesn't flee because we planted our feet. He flees because he sees the grace of Yahweh, the power of Yahweh rest on us. He knows he's in for a whipping. Jude 1:4. There are certain men crept in unaware who were before of old ordained to this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of our Yahweh into lasciviousness or unbridled lust, and denying, and we've seen that word means to contradict, contradicting the only Elohim and our Messiah, Yeshua. To turn, it says turning the grace. To turn means to exchange one thing for the other. You know, light for dark, good for evil. But here it's turning the grace into unbridled lust. Grace is the power that enables us not to sin. They have turned it into the power to be able to sin and not be held accountable for it. Right. You get that? It's to exchange one thing for another. Grace enables us not to sin. Jude says they've turned it into the power that will allow you to sin and not be held accountable. He says ungodly men talk about grace in that way. The very last words you will find in your Bible are these: the grace of our Messiah Yeshua be with you all. How important must grace be? The very last words. The grace of Yeshua be with you. We need His power, don't we? Yeah. So, in conclusion, we are under grace, but we need to embrace what that word means. Sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. Grace empowers us to win. Grace empowers us to obey. Grace empowers us to walk in obedience, which is defined as righteousness. Grace saved us. Grace sanctifies us. Again, people confuse grace and mercy. Yahweh is merciful, but we cannot take for granted that He will be merciful if we have transgressed willingly, despite the grace given to us to prevent us from transgressing. Grace is not power that protects us even if we sin. Grace is power that enables us not to sin. That's the reason He said in Romans 6:14, sin shall not have dominion over you. Learning Torah is essential. And it's been quite a journey seeking to do that, hasn't it? Learning Torah has been essential. But the day has come for the emphasis to shift just a little bit to the place where we become more aware, more cooperative with the power working in us to keep Torah, and more aware of the leadership of the Ruach HaKodesh in us to keep Torah, so that we begin to walk in fellowship and unison with the Father more than just the schoolmaster. That makes sense? Yes. Okay. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace as His name is put upon you. So shall He bless you.